Welcome to Girl in the Gov, the podcast,
where our goal is to make politics more accessible and less intimidating.
The show features an interview with an expert in the political field, walking us through the many cues we have about politics, civics, government, and more.
By providing civic education in the places we are, on our phones, and in the language we speak. And yes, we know we say like a lot.
It's kind of the point, because politics needed a rebrand. Welcome back to Girl in the Gov, the podcast. Officially 1 week out meaning post from Election Day. And we have been watching all these results come in. We talked about it in our intro last week about how we're just the two smartest girlies in the political space, I think, just period.
Brilliant genius.
No one's even close, honestly. You can hear it in our prediction, basically results episode, pre-election and post-election, is confirming that we were right. So again, we will not stop talking about that. But speaking of results and election results and how crazy it's been, we had Brian Derrick on our top stories episode yesterday to run us through all of the results, which I couldn't think of a better person to do that.
Facts. Literally the perfect guest for the occasion. We love Brian always, but Brian really has been on top of all things election because he is basically like an elections guru, in my opinion. I haven't used guru 100%. In forever as a word, but bringing it back, having a moment.
Truly a
Brian
politics
Derrick,
guru,
political
honestly.
Guru. Yeah.
Because we talked about it with him, how he's been on that was his third time on the show, and first one was Build Back Better. So he's policy guru. Second one was redistricting. So electoral guru again. But yes, absolutely slayed going through all of these results, and not only the ones that we are just seeing on our news apps and TVs and such, aka the Senate, the House, some of these governors' races that are kind of more in the mainstream of things, but talking about these state houses and how impactful those results are. So super important stuff to go over. And yeah, also talking about just the impact and what it's going to look like moving forward. So go listen if you haven't yet. If you haven't, run, don't walk,
Run, sprint. This is if you've been I want to get into running, you're thinking, you know what, maybe you were inspired by the New York Marathon. You're you know what, this is the time for me to get into it. Absolutely. Do it. Sprint to this episode. Run to it. Or look, some people listen to podcasts on runs. Put it on. Put it on. I also just want to make one note of during this recording, we literally got the Arizona results for the governor's race. So you get to see our little live reaction.
100%.
And
that was a special moment.
Pleased. Ecstatic, which is such a hard word to say, by the way.
And did you see Brian's story? He was last night, he was I went back to my phone and he's I was recording a podcast. I went back to my phone. I got all these hate DMs that I hadn't done a dance video yet to these governor's results in Arizona. And it was literally our fault.
Sorry, Brian. We love you.
I literally offered him, I was can you please make the dancing story right now on this recording? Because that would have been such a special moment for this show and for my life, honestly.
Yeah, really. I think that's a personal plug.
That's a life highlight, 100%. Well, in other news, outside of election, we are back. Congress is back.
We're back, baby.
Yes, and the House and the Senate started the lame duck session on Monday. So what's happening in Congress is government funding is the most important unfinished priority as appropriators face a December 16th deadline. The Defense Authorization Bill. Oh my God, hello. Ukraine aid, same-sex marriage, electoral college reform, and maybe even a debt limit boost will be debated over the closing weeks of the 117th Congress. Yet what's really at stake is the future of the Republican Party, both on and off Capitol Hill, which is going to be the most interesting thing to watch. Just not only them deciding who is going to be Speaker of the House, given that they are likely to take the House in a small majority, which we talk about on Brian's episode and what that all means. And if you're oh, fuck, they took the House, there's some silver linings in these results, and we talk about it with Brian, so definitely go listen. And then Donald Trump is expected to announce Tuesday, okay, when we're recording this, but future you guys listeners are probably sitting on this news already, that he's running for the White House again, which is setting off this debate inside the GOP of whether they're going to stick with the MAGA vibes or if they're going to finally graduate. There's members of Congress invited to Mar-a-Lago for this announcement, so it seems like it will happen, given that there is literally an event planned and in place. But it's just crazy because the whole story around this was that Trump was waiting for these results and waiting to see how his candidates did to then decide if he's going to announce, which it literally couldn't have gone worse for Donald Trump in these election results. So again, we also said it, let it be known, let the records show that we literally said, given his ego, we expect him, regardless of what happens, to still announce and still go for it. So again, it'll be interesting, but I'm more interested to see like what the rest of the GOP does. These like statements that they're making where they're like, we need to change leadership, we need to change things, we need to regroup. And that awareness is something that I don't always expect from them, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I also think, though, it's funny, like, yes, leadership matters, but at the end of the day, like, personally, I think Mitch McConnell hates Trump as much as he sucks his dick.
And most of them do, which is
I know, but it's one of those things,
over
like,
the past few years.
I feel like, and granted, not in, you know, the Republican clubhouse, there could be some missing links that I'm not aware of or whatever, but it seems like Mitch McConnell, I can't believe I'm defending Mitch McConnell right now, like reacted to what the group wanted. Like, okay, you guys are all going to jump on MAGA train. I see that for me to get something done, I have to unite with that and then lead with that in mind.
Yeah. Like,
and
they're
if
all
anything,
the problem.
They're all the problem. So they're just going to eat each other alive, which have a great time. Don't forget seasoning. You know, like, well, speaking of things that we will have to see what happens, all eyes are on Georgia because we have a runoff on December 6th. Unfortunately, you cannot register to vote beforehand because of a voter suppression law that was passed last year. So if you are listening to this and you know someone in Georgia that wants to register to vote in the runoff, unfortunately, that's not possible. However, it does mean that we need to get every single voter out there that showed up this time around or didn't show up but is registered to vote in the state of Georgia out to vote. So 100%. This is your reminder to text everyone you know in Georgia and have them text all of their friends because friends don't let friends miss elections, including runoff elections. So that's the tea. And also speaking of,
that.
No, we can still say that.
I know, but it's like we have some time before we like have to like scream it from the rooftops again.
Okay, fine. We're bringing it down to like a lower octave. But speaking of that phrase, our collection of social goods is still available. So if you guys are thinking of holiday gifts ready, little stocking stuffers or gifts for your friends, maybe you guys are doing like a little holiday party gift exchange type thing. Yes. Our collection of social goods is perfect for it. We've got a trucker hat. We've got stickers. We've got a pop socket. We've got tote. You can get the tote, put some of the items in it. There you go. You've got 100%. a whole gift ready to roll. Yep. So go get it at socialgoods.com.
And speaking of a little housekeeping moment as well, and speaking of like not stopping, encouraging your friends to vote, but also encouraging your friends to keep the political and civic engagement going post-election. That is such an important message here. And we talk about it a little bit with Brian too, about how moving forward, the like key piece of what these results mean and like its future impact is that we have to keep going and that this should really just be a start. And so join our brand ambassador program because we are continuing the civic engagement there. It's a community of young women who want to keep the conversation going and share resources, share action items, share funny memes, whatever it is. And then there's also political networking opportunities. If you want to work in the space, or maybe you're just curious, learning more, you can join and get in on those conversations, which have been super helpful for a lot of people. So that's been really awesome. But join our brand ambassador program. You can go to girlinthegov.com and go to the brand ambassador page, learn a little bit about it, apply, and then you'll meet us on a quick phone call, introduce yourself, and then we'll get you into the program. But there's no requirements, no time requirements. It's fully volunteer based. So no worries on if, you're super busy. It's whatever you have time for. We just want to bring you in to the community, and also ask your friends if they want to join you in that effort to just join our little Slack group, contribute to the conversation here and there. And again, just growing this Girl in the Gov community, this Gov club,
To Maddie's point about staying engaged, one of the big factors that has come out so far post-election is that young women have literally changed the course of these elections. And we need to continue doing that. So stay engaged, stay with us, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Girl in the Gov, the podcast, as well as on TikTok, Pinterest. I do need to upload some stuff there. Sorry, guys. It's happening. LinkedIn. And of course, like Maddie said, join the brand ambassador program, share it with friends. Now, this week's interview. We've really done so many back-to-back interview episodes by total accident because we keep hijacking our top stories. Regardless, this was one of these conversations that was so fucking fun where I did not want to get off the Zoom.
No, and you learn so much, and it's so interesting, so fascinating, and such important information to know.
Literally, in this particular episode, we talk about critical race theory. So you may have heard that also as CRT. It has been the talk of the town on the Republican side, trying to be ban CRT. And then a lot of questions around, well, what is CRT?
And they don't know what it is.
There's so many questions. So anyways, we brought on the most amazing human to run us through it because she is an expert in CRT. In critical race theory, and that is Dr. Khiara Bridges. She's a professor at UC Berkeley, law professor. You also might know Dr. Bridges from her viral clip, literally handing Josh Hawley's ass to himself on a platter. If not, we need to link it. It will be linked. Yeah, let's get into it. And without further ado, here's Dr. Bridges. Well, we are locked and loaded and ready to roll and to talk about your career, talk about CRT, so many different avenues that we need to go down. But let's back it up to your current career, which is the fact that you're a law professor at Berkeley. Yeah. And thing one is, how is being back at school? How's the semester so far?
I know. So if I'm honest, should I be honest? No, yes. I'm going to be honest. I love teaching. I love talking about the law. I love dressing up for class. I love picking out my clothes. I love the whole thing. But there is something sweet about not having to be in a classroom, for 2 to 3 hours at a time. There's something very sweet about being able to conduct my own research and kind of structure my day in the way that I want to. So the semester always feels like, as much as I love it, it always feels like I can't wait until it's over so that I can do the other things that I love to do.
Yeah,
1,000%.
Sure.
We need outfit dates,
right? So being for the past, because of the pandemic, we were online. We were on Zoom for a year and a half, and I was so excited to come back to in-person teaching because I love clothes and shoes and accessories. Yes. So I love playing dress up, and I love a very nice heel. I love large earrings. I love, patterns and color. So it's definitely something that makes me excited about getting up in the morning.
It sounds like we all need to go on a shopping trip together.
I would love that. Yes.
we are both very short and big heel wearers, especially me. So Sign us up. We're gonna do a trip.
Absolutely. I'm down. Whenever there's an excuse for me to go shopping, I take it.
Yes, 100%. Well, getting into, your studies and really how you even got here to, dressing up for class every day. Can you give us kind of your journey into this role and into, studying this specific topic and into teaching?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I've always wanted to go to law school when I was very young, when I was 7 years old, I believe. The legend goes, people would ask me, what do I want to be when I grow up? And I would say, I want to be a lawyer. And I don't know why I wanted to be a lawyer. I often explain it in terms of I'm a contrarian. I'm like a little black sheep of my family. And I come from a family in which there are a lot of medical doctors and there are 0 lawyers. And so being a lawyer seemed like, something that no one else had done in my family. And it seemed also interesting. So I kind of just stayed on that path throughout middle school and high school and college. And I applied to law school at the, end of college and ended up going to Columbia. And then I kind of had to figure out just exactly what it means to be a lawyer. And the reality is that you can do a lot of things with your JD. You can litigate, you can do sort of corporate work, you can, like deals, you can do nonprofit work, you can do appellate work. So, and you kind of just don't know that. Like, being the first lawyer in my family, I had no idea the many different careers that you could pursue with the JD. So it wasn't until I got to law school that I was like, what kind of lawyer do I want to be? And it turns out that the most exciting thing about the law for me was researching it and writing about it. So like actually being a law professor seemed like what I wanted to do with my JD. And so then I had to figure out how I was going to become a law professor. And one becomes a law professor, a couple of different paths, but I decided to do the PhD route. And so after law school, I applied for a PhD in anthropology. And then I did a postdoc after I got my PhD. And then I got my first law teaching job. But the way that I came to pregnancy and reproductive rights and justice specifically, I mentioned already that I come from a family full of doctors. Well, my Uncle Jay, it's kind of like the patriarch of my family, and he was the first board-certified obstetrician. First Black board-certified obstetrician in Miami, Florida. So he was delivered thousands of babies over the course of his career. So I was very interested in pregnancy and working with pregnant folks, but I didn't want to work with them in the way that he worked with them. So I came to be able to work with pregnant folks by thinking about pregnancy and thinking about the ways that society regulates it, the way the society celebrates it for some, thinks of it as a social problem for others. So I've been very interested in just investigating, just the myriad ways that people's bodies are problematized or held up as ideals in the context of pregnancy and parenting and mothering and fathering. And so that's been kind of my career.
Yeah, that's awesome. Really impressive.
That's amazing. And I totally feel you on the non-doctor route because I faint at just about every doctor's appointment. So
there you go. Yeah. And I'm also a hypochondriac, I don't particularly like being around sick people.
Actually, I've never thought about that. Like when you're going through med school, you're basically just sitting and looking at WebMD all day. Just you're like, do I have cancer?
Do I have
this
that
lump on my hand?
Exactly. I'm pretty sure I would have diagnosed myself with everything that I studied.
Yeah, I'm surprised that's not a thing doctors do deal with more. They're hypochondriacs.
Yeah. Wait, that's actually such a good question. One of my best friends is a resident right now, and I will be asking her immediately after, do you self-diagnose? How does this happen? What's the vibe? So nonetheless, another conversation to have, but within what you just said, you mentioned doing research and compiling some of that research and kind of figuring out the next pathways for that. Right. And you've written a number of publications, books on your research. Can you tell us about the process for compiling research, for writing a book? How does that go down?
Yeah. So I have my PhD in anthropology, and the methodology of anthropology is ethnography and fieldwork. So for my first book is in ethnography. I conducted 18 months of fieldwork in a public hospital, in an obstetrics clinic in that hospital. And I was working with low-income pregnant folks trying to navigate bureaucracies, navigate the problematization of their bodies, of their fertility, all while trying to hang on to their dignity and their humanity and their, self-determination. So the process for writing a book like my first book, Reproducing Race, which is an ethnography, is much different than writing my second book, which is called Poverty of Privacy Rights. And that's a very sort of legal analysis of the things that I sort of analyzed ethnographically in my first book. So for my first book, it's just a whole bunch of the methodology of ethnography is really just sitting and observing and watching and participating when you have an opportunity and interviewing. It just kind of I think of it as embedding myself in my field. So when I was working at the hospital, I just first of all, I waited around a lot, just looking and observing and seeing people's their comings and going. And then after a while, because it was a public hospital where they're very short staffed and I was there, I was able to eventually kind of help out. So I was doing pregnancy tests. I was checking people in for their appointments. I was giving them information about, as also I speak Spanish. And so I was like a Spanish translator. So I was able to not just observe, but actually participate. And so after 18 months, and also lots of interviews, right? So I interviewed the patients, I interviewed the staff, I interviewed the residents, attendings, I interviewed everybody over the course of this 18 months. And then after you compile all of this, just field notes and interviews, and you transcribe them, and then eventually you kind of have to identify themes that emerge. Like one theme that emerged when I was doing my research was like how much distrust there was of the patients, right? This is a hospital that's kind of built to help vulnerable people. And at the same time, there was so much distrust of the patients that were being helped. And so I analyze that in terms of like these larger, discourses that circulate about how low-income people shouldn't be pregnant in the first place, how they're a drain on society, how their kids are like our future social problems. And I sort of analyzed the very particular things that I observed in light of these sort of larger forces. So, I picked out themes. I came up with 6 of them, I believe. Those became my 6 chapters. And then, I was, off to writing and researching. I like to research as I write. And so it's kind of like an iterative process, I come up with an idea, I research the idea, I write a little bit about it, I find out I need more research, I go, consult back with my notes. And there's this kind of like iterative process where at the end of it, I got a book. And then, my second book, Poverty and Privacy Rights, is very different. Like I didn't have the benefit of field work for that. It was an entirely different type of book. It's a very legal book. It's an analysis of the meaning, the meaningfulness of saying that we have rights. And specifically privacy rights, like the right to determine whether we have a child or not have a child, the right to parent our children in the way that we see fit. And the argument in that book is that, low-income people don't have that right. They've been disenfranchised of that right because of their poverty, because we don't trust poor people. And that book was very different. I divided it in terms of sort of areas of privacy. So family privacy, reproductive privacy, informational privacy, spatial privacy. And the process was the same in the sense of this iterative sort of thing where I think I have an idea, but then like I have to research a little bit more, and then I write it, and then I have to research, and then at the end of 18 months, there's a book there.
18 months. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Just thinking of like the longest essay I've ever written, and I'm just like, that I used to hate doing that. Imagine doing a book, but it seems like such an interesting process. Like,
my problem is that I actually write too much. Like I promised my editor 100,000 words, and then when I turned in the final manuscript, it was like 150,000, and she's like, "Nah, we're not going to do this."
No, I never had that problem. I was always like double, like a little bit over a double space, just to like see if I can get a few more pages out of it.
Larger font, I get
like,
it.
do professors have an eye for that? Like, maybe you could tell me.
Like I love when students can be like short and sweet. I love that. There's definitely a power in being economical with your words.
Well, yeah, I was always taught, to be really concise with how you write and like really get to the point. And then, but then they're like, but make it 20 pages.
Right.
I'm like, well.
There's a contradiction there. I feel
I'm like, excuse me. Well, we want to talk about one of your other books, which is Critical Race Theory, a primer. Can you tell us a little bit about this book and kind of the process there too? Was it similar, or how did that work?
Well, actually, so that book was different because I was planning. So, we get sabbaticals every couple of years as academics. And during this particular sabbatical, I think it was like 2017 or 2018, I can't remember. I was planning on working on the book that I'm currently working on now, which is another ethnography. But before the sabbatical, I got approached by the guy who would become my editor. And he said, I think there's a need for a book that explains critical race theory. Now, mind you, this was in 2017, which is like before most people have heard Yeah, right. So, and it's so funny that I wrote that book and it was published in 2018. It was either at the very end of 2018 or 2019, before the hullabaloo happened over critical race theory. And so I kind of feel like my editor is a little, psychic, but anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was just like, I think we need there's a need for a book that sort of describes this theory, kind of, gives its basic kind of principles, applies it to different areas of life, and, make it short, make it readable. And he's like, I think you can do it because I'm a critical race theorist. So it's like, that sounds like something I would like to spend my sabbatical doing. So I came up with, so critical race theory is an advanced legal theory. And so the first, I was like, we need an introduction. So, let me briefly describe the theory in the introduction. And then I was like, and I need to give a history of this thing because, where did it come from? Why did people think that it was like necessary? Gave a history of it. I talked about controversies within the theory. And then I have chapters on major concepts within critical race theory, like intersectionality, like the concept of white privilege, like the relationship between race and class, because oftentimes those things are reduced into one another. And then I wanted to end the book by applying it to different areas of life, like health and affirmative action. And so I sort of charted out what I thought the book could do and could cover. Also, what did I have expertise to talk about? Because critical race theory can be applied to a range of areas. And so, for example, we can do a critical race theoretical analysis of the immigration law. I'm not an immigration lawyer. I'm not good at it. I don't know much about it. So I kind of could not talk about that. But I've been doing reproductive justice, for my entire adult life. So I have a chapter in the book on the welfare state and reproduction. So that's how the book came to be. And like I said, it was published at the end of this, 2018 or 2019. And then this whole, culture war over critical race theory started in 2020. So again, my editor was a little psychic.
Literally,
Totally.
I can't get over that. I kind of want to like do a little meeting, see what else he predicts.
Can I get a reading?
Little Ouija board situation.
Get the tarot cards out. Like I'm ready. I love it.
Oh yeah, too good. Well, speaking of critical race theory, getting into it, we definitely want to give a primer for our audience and starting with some of the basic questions, which is, what is critical race theory?
Okay, so critical race theory, it's an advanced legal theory. It emerged in law schools in, I would say, the 80s and then in the 90s. And the question that prompted its emergence was, the civil rights movement had happened, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been passed. We had made all of these gains in terms of racial justice. But law professors started looking around in the 1980s and 1990s, and they sort of saw kind of dramatic racial inequality. And they're like, how could it be that, we overcame in the 1960s, we had all of these civil rights laws passed, but there still is racial inequality, decades later. And so they were interested in investigating how it was that law had been unsuccessful, in producing the outcomes that we had fought for. And so critical race theory really is an investigation into the limits of the law, how has law been used to, improve matters when it comes to race, but how has law also been used to kind of justify inequality, to reiterate inequality, to make invisible the mechanisms by which inequality is produced. And so that's what critical race theory is. It's really a critique of progressive understandings of race. It's the progressive understandings of race, specifically, I call it, liberal civil rights discourse, kind of conceptualizes racism as what happens when bad actors do bad things. Like when people think racist thoughts and do bad things, well, that's what racism is. And that's kind of like what our civil rights laws is designed, what they're designed to solve, right? It's like, let's find these racists, let's find these bad actors, and let's, run them out of public life. But what if that's not the mechanism by which racial inequality is reproduced in the post-civil rights era? Like, what if racial inequality is not, like a guy behind the curtain who's like, I shall, make sure that people of color are poorer than everybody else.
Right.
What if racial inequality is produced by race-neutral laws that just have the effect of reproducing historic racial inequality? What if it's more structural and institutional mechanisms that produce racial inequality as opposed to individual bad actors? If our laws are interested in finding individual bad actors, then we're going to be unsuccessful in producing racially just outcomes. And so critical race theory really is a critique of the way the traditional civil rights discourse has conceptualized race and racism and the problem of racial inequality.
Totally. That's such a good explainer too. I think you're right. Like, some of the laws that were passed in the 1960s, right, were almost like a disguise, ended up being just like a disguise for the racist things that happen just systemically, like across the board, that we don't think about, that, again, that white privilege that most people are raised not to even think about or not know about. And I think it's obviously such an important thing for people to know, to study, et cetera. We'll get into that a little bit. But we want to kind of keep going on this line of questions too, to kind of get a better understanding. So what is a colorblind law or policy, and how does that fit in here?
Yeah, so colorblind laws. So a couple of different directions I could take that question. Colorblind laws are laws that don't have race on their face. So for example, the laws that were problematic in the era of of formal racial inequality that produced segregated schools said that, okay, these were white schools and Black kids couldn't go to those white schools, or these were white schools and Mexican kids couldn't go to those schools. So that was a facially race-based law. And a colorblind law would be one that doesn't have race on its face. And so that kind of gets into some of the problems of color blindness, right? So, of course, when you use race on the face of a law in order to deny a historically marginalized group access to benefits or goods or services or just basic necessities, right? Then it seems like the answer is color blindness, right? Like, if you're keeping kids out of well-funded schools with great, physical plants on the basis of race, then it seems like the answer is, okay, stop, regulating and treating people differently on the basis of race. The problem is that in the post-civil rights era, our schools are just about as segregated as they were before Brown versus Board. And it's clearly not because there are schools out there that's like, nope, only white kids in here. You got to go to the Mexican school down the street. Rather, our schools are segregated because of race-neutral processes that don't have race on their face. So if we think it is a social good to have integrated schools, if we think it is good for my therapist called it, people to have these interpersonal collisions, right? If we think it's actually good for the country to have heterogeneous classrooms and communities and churches and corporations and institutions, then we can't throw our hands up and say no more, putting race in the law. We might need race-conscious efforts to bring about a racially integrated society. We might need race-conscious efforts to produce racially integrated schools. And so colorblindness is often deployed by the right in a post-civil rights era, the era that we're living in. Is often used by the right to protect the racial inequality, the racial segregation that we see across institutions.
Like, see, we did something, but it just bleeds into everything else. And it's like legal segregation, basically. It becomes like that.
It's kind of like what you were saying, the civil rights laws, the fact that we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was passed and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it's kind of been used as an excuse to do nothing else. It's kind of like, we
Exactly.
did it. Let's pat ourselves on the back. Let's, high fives
Yeah.
and go home. When instead, that was an awesome first step.
Right.
It
And very necessary one.
got some things done. But now looking at the way society is working, the way institutions are operating, the way you look outside and what it looks like, what else do we need to do in order to, I say, live, fulfill the vision, the values that we purport to hold dear as a nation. It's right there in the Constitution. It says something about liberty and justice and equality. Like, what do we need in order to achieve that? And it's clearly not just formal racial inequality.
Totally.
Well, for another key question here, what is the difference between institutional racism and structural? This is definitely a question we get a lot. I'm curious, sort of your POV on it.
Yeah, so I actually have a chapter on institutional structural racism in my program. It really depends on the theorist that you're asking. Some theorists think of institutional and structural racism as kind of synonyms, like they mean the same thing, while others believe that they are distinct. For those who believe, so what both of those things are referring to are not individualist racism. So, individualist racism being like a bigot, right? A racist, a white supremacist, something like that. And in what institutional/structural racism is referring to, it's not bigotry, but rather these other processes that produce racial inequality. Now, when people think of those concepts as distinct, institutional racism as being distinct from structural racism, they think of institutional racism as referring to intra-institutional processes that exclude. So think of one institution, for example, law school. Law schools have these processes. We have standardized tests. In order to get into law school, we privilege grade. We privilege all the sort of like indicia of merit. Like, did you volunteer? Did you travel? How many languages do you speak? Those sorts of things. And those sorts of things tend to be a good indicator of class privilege and wealth. So when we rely on LSATs and grades and did you travel and, did you volunteer, as opposed to asking questions like, were you raising your little brother while you were trying to go to high school? Or did you have to work throughout, as opposed to relying on your parents paying your tuition?
Right.
When we rely on those traditional indicia of merit, we do a great job of excluding historically marginalized groups. So we can call that institutional racism, because the institution of law school is embracing criteria that exclude.
Right.
That might be versus structural racism, some theorists say, because structural racism sort of looks across institutions, looks across various areas of society, and looks at how institutional processes intersect in order to disadvantage non-white groups. And so that same analysis would say, okay, law schools might be an institution that might be excluding, but we can't understand the way that law school excludes without looking at the way that our public schools are funded, right? We fund public schools through property tax. And property taxes, that mechanism of funding public schools does a great job of making sure that the kids in the suburbs have very well-funded schools because the property tax base is high, while ensuring that the kids in the hood have underfunded schools because the tax base is low. And so when you look at that in concert with a lack of infrastructure, right? So folks in the hood can't get to the jobs and at the corporate parks in the suburbs. And then you look at that in concert with, and so you just look at different sort of institutions across society, and the way that they interact to produce disadvantage would be understood as structural racism. So those are sort of two, again, they might be synonyms, but when they are distinct institutions, but institutional racism would look at one institution kind of in isolation from others, while structural racism would look at them in operating, sort of interacting with one another.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, lovely. Next one on the list is, what is implicit bias? Another kind of one I feel like we hear a lot.
I know people love to talk about implicit bias, maybe less so today in light of the backlash. But implicit bias is just the idea that we have associations and aversions that we are not necessarily conscious of, but that nevertheless influence our behavior, like we act on them. And so the idea might be that if I were to ask a random person, hey, do you associate Black men with criminality? They'd be like, of course not. Like, I'm not a bigot. But when they do the implicit association test, which is this test that sort of tests the associations that you make subconsciously, they sort of ask you to link happy and unhappy words with Black and white, or, whatever group they're testing against. It's under intense time constraints. So you can't sort of think and pause. You just got to go real fast. Implicit biases are those things that people don't think that they don't think that they have. They might not even want to have. But when you do the implicit association test, it reveals that, there is an association between Black males and criminality, or, Latinx people and undocumented, status, or, LGBTQ people and weakness, or, so, and again, it's not just that people have them, but rather they act on them. And so there are tons of experiments done by psychologists that show that you give someone an implicit association test to see, what their implicit biases are. And then you ask them to do a task. And again, most of the time it's under intense time constraints, and they'll act on the implicit biases that they have. I do a lot of work in, reproductive justice, and so healthcare and medicine. And there are these studies that, have given physicians the implicit association test to see whether they have, anti-Black or pro-white implicit biases. And those physicians that do tend to discount Black people's pain. They tend not to recommend Black people for the most effective treatments. So again, it has very real consequences. And so that's kind of it's not just an interesting fact about oneself, but rather it has very real consequences in the real world.
Totally.
I have a question. I don't know if this is really a tangent, but do you think it would be helpful if hospitals or other institutions did these tests as part of a hiring process? And maybe this exists and I totally am just out to lunch on it.
Yeah.
But they did that sort of test, and then therefore they could design some sort of training based off of those results.
Yeah.
Would that help decrease? I mean, obviously it's not a one, not, what's the phrase I'm trying to think of? Not one shoe fits all.
Right.
One size fits all. Oh my God. One shoe?
That's good though. It's also true. One shoe does not fit all.
True. Very true. Facts.
This is true.
I think, some institutions have maybe required or encouraged implicit bias trainings, I would say, or at least that, folks do the implicit association test, because the idea is that we need to know if you have implicit biases, because then it behooves you to kind of do something about them. And so I have a critique of implicit bias, which I'll get to in a second. But I will say that some institutions have, there are some medical schools, there are some residency programs that require the students to take an implicit association test and then be mindful of the implicit biases that they have as they go out there in the world. I know that some institutions have done cultural competency training so that people know how to interact with and engage with difference, however that difference, the form that difference might take. So I think those are laudable, right? I don't think that institutions should not be doing that. I will also say the interest that some institutions have been taking in terms of addressing or just making their employees aware of the fact of implicit bias and the fact of, cultural or racial difference, that has been the source of the backlash that we saw in 2020 after George Floyd was killed. Like, a lot of institutions became interested in, like, why are they so mad? Like, why are they protesting in Minneapolis and across the country? And so, we had a racial reckoning, and a lot of corporations, institutions, workplaces wanted to sort of bring information about racial inequality to their employees, and people got offended. And then it became a huge culture war. My critique of implicit bias is as follows. I think that we're worried about the wrong thing. I think that if we want people not to have implicit biases and not to act on implicit biases, we need to ask why people have implicit biases in the first place. And people have implicit biases in the first place because we have organized our society in such a way that people come to associate Black males with criminality.
Right.
People come to associate Latinx people with an undocumented status. Those associations make sense to people because our world has made it make sense. So if we want to get rid of the association between Black males and criminality, I think that the easy way out, and not an effective way out, is to give somebody an implicit association test and say, hey, you think of criminals when you think of Black men, stop doing that. And instead, how about we address the criminalization of Black communities? How about we think of non-carceral solutions for our social problems? So I'm interested in doing the hard work when it comes
to... It's like a Band-Aid, actually, when you think about it.
I was just thinking that.
And another thing that allows us to pat ourselves on the back and then continue with the status quo. It allows us to say, we gave our employees an implicit association test, and we, brought in this guy, and he talked about cultural competency, and go back to do what you were doing before, as opposed to doing the hard work of organizing society differently so that, that people think different thoughts.
That's such a good point.
And so that's how we would have more just outcomes.
Totally.
I mean, I think treating at the source, waiting to the problem gets uglier and uglier, and having to try and fix it from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's that's an issue with the way we approach, I feel like almost every issue too, right? Is we're always trying to find these Band-Aids or short-term solutions, which obviously I think we still need, but the real effort should be going towards these kind of more foundational issues that we can hopefully solve there to prevent, more of this happening in the future. So I feel like we just see that across the board, but it's such a good way to think about it. I've never thought that way. So that was very interesting. Last question on our list, promise, and then we'll get into some other stuff, is what is intersectionality?
Yeah, intersectionality, it's a concept. So the phrase intersectionality, fun fact, it was coined by a law professor, Professor Kim Crenshaw. She's amazing. She's also the person who came up with the term critical race theory. So
there we go.
she is very good at coming up with, phrases that capture, concepts or bodies of knowledge. And so when I hear people talking about critical race theory in ways that the right has proposed as true critical race theory, it irritates me, because Kim Crenshaw literally came up with this phrase to identify a distinct body of knowledge. All that to say, intersectionality refers to a concept that actually predates Kim Crenshaw naming it as such, but it's just the idea that people experience their identities differently depending on other identities that they have. And so in the foundational piece that Kim Crenshaw wrote on this, she compared Black women with white women and Black women with Black men. And she's like, we tend to think of racism as it affects Black men. The subject of anti-racism tends to be male. And so when we think of racism, we think of police brutality, and we think of prisons and jails, and we think of, denial of voting rights. We don't think of obstetric violence, for example. We don't think of doctors performing C-sections on Black women unnecessarily. Like they're not medically indicated. Nobody consented to it, but they're going to do it anyway because it's expedient. We don't think of the child welfare system like taking kids away from their mothers, not because their mothers don't love them or are abusive to them, rather because their mothers are poor. Right. So the subject of anti-racism tends to be a Black male. And so it makes invisible the way that racism impacts Black women and, other, Black non-binary people. And the same thing when it comes to sexism. Kim Crenshaw's intervention was to say the subject of feminism is a white woman. And so when we think of sexism, we think of the way that sexism has showed up in the lives of white women. So we think of like being denied the ability to be, to access contraception and to be sterilized, to get a tubal ligation because a racist, sexist society wanted white women to reproduce. We don't think of the ways that sexism looks when it fests in the lives of Black women. Again, the denial of custody of their kids, forced sterilizations, right? Like while white women were being compelled to reproduce, Black women and Latinx women, Indigenous women were being denied the ability to reproduce because society didn't want them to. So intersectionality is really a concept that asks us to take seriously the ways that oppression as well as privilege might manifest differently depending on other categories of identity that people have. And so it could be, one of the critiques of intersectionality is like, okay, so just how many intersections do we have here? I just talked about race and, sex. What about sexuality, right? What about gender identity? What about class? What about whether one is native born or foreign born? What about ability, right? Surely a Black, cis woman who is able-bodied, able-minded, racism might look differently to her than a Black cis woman who has a disability, mental, physical disability, right? So one of the critiques of intersectionality is like, well, how then, which intersections are important? But I think and people have written books about that as a limitation of intersectionality.
That it can be kind of all like overwhelming or something.
It can be overwhelming, And it can also be impossible to create coalitions, like political coalitions.
Oh, yeah.
Like, like if it's kind of like what we're seeing today when it comes to abortion, right? Like this fight over whether we need to use the word women or not. Like should we say pregnant women or should we say pregnant people capable of pregnancy? The fear is that we won't be able to create this coalition if we don't name this thing as something that affects women, right? And if Black women are over here talking about that is not my battle, or that's your battle, white women, that's the battle that you've always fought, and it becomes more difficult to have like a political
separates a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think that it's a danger, perhaps, of intersectionality, but I don't think that it is a limit. It's not a reason to discard the sort of framework, the concept altogether, because I think it brings to light some important things that we ought to consider.
Totally. It's so important for people to like understand, but then from there, like how do you kind of implement it into solutions and such? But
absolutely.
Okay, well, we made it through our I Have a Stupid Question segment. So thank you for answering all of those. We appreciate it. We kind of want to talk about the political world and how critical race theory has now stepped into that space weirdly, or politics has, forced itself into that space. I'm not sure which way it went. But can you kind of explain why critical race theory has become so political? Was there kind of a catalyst that brought it into political rhetoric? Like, how did it start kind of getting political like this?
I think there's an obvious origin story to it, and that is the racial reckoning that people said that we were having in the summer following George Floyd's murder. So there was a lot of protests, but even more so than the protests, there was a shift in the way that people initially began to think about like the reality of police violence. And I've told this story before, but I have to tell it again. So, we're like in the throes of the pandemic, in the summer of 2020. And, there were protests everywhere. And I really needed to order some soap to my house because I was out of soap. And I went on Amazon.com.
Sure.
And the first thing that I see when the page opens is this banner that says Black Lives Matter. And then it gave me some reading recommendations, some books that I could buy if I wanted to learn more about, why and how Black Lives Matter. And I was just so struck by that because it was only a couple of years before that, saying Black Lives Matter, was identifying yourself as left of left, right?
Yeah.
Just radical. You can't say Black Lives Matter in public spaces and not expect to be identified as
Right.
radical. But there I was, Jeff Bezos, was letting me know that Black Lives Matter. And so,
Amazon of all places.
Yeah. And so there was a shift in the way that we had come. I sort of think of it in terms of that summer, people were like, well, maybe these critiques that I've been hearing and that have been circulating about institutional racism and structural racism, and maybe there's something to that. Let's think more about it. And like I said, I think institutions began trying to bring some of that into their institutions, exposing their employees to it. And then, there's only so much you can do before somebody tries to capitalize on it. And I identify Christopher Rufo. He's a conservative activist, and he went on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News in September 2020. And he was complaining that federal agencies were teaching federal employees critical race theory. That's what he called it. And his entreaty was for the Trump administration to do something about it because it was a caricature. I wouldn't even say a caricature. It was a falsity of what critical race theory is. It wasn't anything that you and I, that we just talked about just now, but rather it was this idea that, critical race theory proposes that all Black people are victims of racism and all white people are racist, and there's an inherent racism to white people as well as America. And it's not in anything of what actual critical race theory proposes. But this is what he called it. He went on Tucker Carlson. Somebody from the Trump administration was paying attention because, days later or weeks later, they issued an executive order banning the teaching of critical race theory and to federal employees with federal monies. Trump lost the election in November, but there was I feel like there was a salient, somebody believed that there was something to this particular culture war. And that's when it spread to K through 12 schools. Because back in September 2020, no one was talking about K through 12 schools.
Right.
It wasn't until after the election that conservative activists started saying, well, critical race theory is being taught not in federal agencies, but the kindergartners, to sixth graders. Sixth graders are learning that they should feel guilt. White sixth graders should be learning that they feel guilty because they're white. Then we saw the sort of rash of legislation that purported to ban critical race theory in K through 12 schools. So they created something that they took a name, they co-opted a name from an advanced legal theory, took that name and then applied it to something that we don't actually know what it is. When the right says we need to get critical race theory out of, K through 12 schools, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
It's like a floating signifier. Tell me what it is. And then they're like, oh, beloved is critical race theory. Toni Morrison, my God, totally. And Ibram Kendi, whatever he's writing, that's critical race theory. And they sort of there's no coherence to it. You just know critical race theory when you see it. And so it's really dangerous, right?
Yeah.
To ban something that there's a vagueness to it, and it can be capacious, it could be narrow, but there's just no there. It just allows them to remove thought from schools that they think it doesn't celebrate America's racial history, this triumphant victory over racism that the right would like to believe us, to tell us that we've had.
Yeah.
Okay, taking one yes, so many thoughts, but them taking one big brush stroke and trying to sort of create their own bullshit.
Always do.
Right. I was going to say, look, at least they're on brand.
Right.
At least they're consistent.
Yeah. I got it. This co-opting of the term critical race theory, we saw it. I spent a lot of my summer of 2021 just trying to fight the forces of disinformation and misinformation. And then here we are in 2022. And now this language of grooming is being used to talk about anything that tells LGBTQ kids that you're worthy of being alive, that you're worthy of love, that there's nothing wrong with you. That sort of tells people that LGBTQ folks have value, are human, deserve dignity. That's grooming now. So yeah, they're wildly on brand, right?
Right.
Co-opting of terms, and deploying them for really, it's conservative / nefarious ends.
Yeah. Do you think really the attack on critical race theory kind of stemmed from even maybe the way the corporate world kind of took on this Black Lives Matter and social impacts, all these stances after 2020? Would you think it was this perceived threat that ultimately let's go after this and shut it down immediately?
I wonder whether, I definitely remember being wary of the sort of corporate take-up of
I want to know your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, the language of anti-racism, right? All of a sudden, Jeff Bezos cares about not Jeff Bezos, but Amazon. Amazon now cares about, Black lives. And it wasn't just Amazon. My retirement is with Betterment. And I got an email from Betterment. They had it. They'd had it with
everyone was on board.
No, I was definitely okay, but do you so what else? What else are you doing besides sending out these really kind of beautiful messages to the people who, whose retirement account you hold? So what else are you doing? But I do think that the attention that just mainstream America was giving to racism and anti-racism just made the regressive forces uncomfortable. And I also think that talking about race is uncomfortable. I can do it all day because kind of my field of study. But it's usually people don't walk into a cocktail party and say, "Hey, have you encountered racial inequality today?"
Yeah.
It's not something that you're supposed to talk about in polite society. So when you go to work and you have to go to this training where, again, some guy is up there, talking about institutional racism and structural racism and implicit bias. And, it was uncomfortable for people. And I think that when the right weaponized talking about race in public in the way that it did, it resonated with a lot of people. I think a lot of people were like, yes, we ought to have a racial recognition.
I'm uncomfortable. Please come save us.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think that there's some truth to, I think they thought that there was some truth to what the protesters were saying. It's wild, right? That we've been talking about police violence in this country since chattel slavery, right? And we're still talking about it today. And the people who tend to be killed in the most spectacular of fashions tend to be Black people, right? So there's that. But then at the same time, I'm trying to go to work and I'm trying to, file my report. And I have to go to this training where I'm being told stuff about race that just makes me uncomfortable. So I think the right capitalized on the discomfort that people felt. Yeah.
That's actually a really good point.
I think it's ironic too. Maybe ironic is not the right term, but it's something where it's not wanting to lose privilege or admitting that in some capacity is showing someone's ugly side, whether it's in a conversation or with oneself. Yeah. And then this is where the irony comes in. But now the larger reaction, this trying to reject CRT or just larger systemic change, that shows even worse the side of these people. Instead of just confronting what needs to change within oneself and society, you're like your larger reaction is just like,
right. Let's literally burn books. Like not a metaphorical book burning, but like a literal book burning, right? Like it's an incredible, like when the proper reaction or the best reaction requires humility, and not only do you not approach it with humility, but rather with fire, right? It's just like there's something went wrong there.
Oh yeah.
And it like stemmed from a not even like a perceived threat, right? Like it wasn't even something that was, trying to be implemented or into K through 12 or whatever it is, but it's just this entire political rhetoric and threat that was created. For what?
When I was in high school, and I'm not that old. But when I was in high, thank you. It's moisturizing.
Yes, we love a skincare routine.
I read Beloved when I was in high school in AP English. Well, with my favorite English professor, she was amazing. And I don't remember it being like your parents have to sign a consent form, permission form.
Which would be crazy.
It was just like, this is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. This was her, in my view, her best work. So rich. Just in terms of story, in like terms literature. It is. And so in 2022, to say that's critical race theory and kids can't learn that anymore, it's like, so what really happened, right? Like what really happened? It's such a loss to, and I tell people, this is not my area of expertise, right? Like I am a legal scholar. I think about the law, but when I think about like just as a lay person, I think it's such a loss for children, like for kids, like for 16-year-olds. I think I was 16 or 15 when I read Beloved, and it resonated with me. It's a beautiful book. And I think it's a loss that children won't be exposed to that. Like that is like now literature that you can't even access in your school's library. You kind of have to like find it on the internet.
Yeah, it's just so insane because everything that we're taught growing up is already so whitewashed. And then it's like you're continuing to cut out Black stories when it's really just like an amazing piece of literature, like on its face. But because it's, a Black story, it's considered critical race theory. That just makes absolutely no sense to me.
I'm with you.
Well, we could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours. And we are unfortunately a little bit out of time here, but this has been amazing. And you've answered our questions amazingly and just been a great explainer for everyone. So we're super excited about this. But is there anything that we can plug for you? Books, social media? Tell us where people can find you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't do the social medias only because I'm scared of Twitter.
I'm like jealous of you.
I'm also one of those people, like I read the comments, like you're not supposed to read the comments, but there I am like, oh my God, people are terrible. And that's all that I would do if I was in social media. So I would just say what I will say is that when you are, and this is to your audience, when you're getting information about what critical race theory is, and this might be a little self-serving, but it's not, look to before 2020. Because
we'll be linking it.
My book came out before the hullabaloo, so I kind of feel like that's what actual critical race theory is. The right will now tell you that critical race theory is something else, but it has been politicized. So if you want to know what critical race theory was before the right co-opted the term, look to pre-2020 things. And it's not just my book, but when I was in law school, we used critical race theory, the essential writings that formed the movement. So there are other books out there on critical race theory. They, predate 2020. And I would look to those sources and not the post 2020 ones that are clearly politicized.
Not Amazon's
right
list.
You know what? My Amazon list comes up pretty good, but then again, it's the algorithm. The algorithm knows me at this point.
Fair.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was awesome.
No, thank you for having me. Thanks for having these conversations. They're really important.
Yes, totally.